Holland established a farming and trade settlement at the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa, in 1652, as a way station for its ships en route to the East Indies. Britain seized it from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars. Britons going to and from India would rest there en route while their ships picked up provisions. Tensions between the British and the Dutch, or Boer settlers, acute from the outset, intensified in 1833 when Britain abolished slavery throughout the empire. Many of the Boers, resentful at being deprived of the forced labour they had used for 200 years, decided to move into the interior of South Africa, a journey remembered today as the Great Trek. As the Voortrekkers moved north and east, they encountered fierce resistance from the expanding Zulu kingdoms of Chaka and Dingaan, but were able to establish two republics, the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. Britain formalised its rule over the Cape Colony, inland from Cape Town, and Natal, inland from Durban. For nearly 200 years, the tip of Africa was interesting only as a way station to India and the Far East. The Dutch settlement was founded at Cape Town in 1652. And the Dutch Boers, many of them puritanical zealots, saw themselves as God's chosen people. For an analogy, think about the Pilgrim Fathers, zealous religious separatists going to a remote part of the world so they can live their own ideal of the perfect religious life. They were also joined by French Huguenots, that is French Protestants expelled by Louis XIV from France itself. The Boers enslaved the Khoi people, the Khoi Africans of the Cape region, whom people they referred to as the Hottentots. And they had the idea, derived from the Bible, that black skin was a mark of God's anger. They trace it to the story in the Bible of after Noah's flood, when Noah gets drunk and his sons find him drunk. One of them, Ham, actually sees his father naked in this condition, and in doing so he commits the act of dishonour and is punished by God. Now, although the Bible doesn't say so, the interpretation given to that story was that he was cursed with a black skin, he and his descendants forever. So that the Boers felt that they had a religious justification for their for their racial discrimination and for their enslavement of the Africans. Britain held Cape Town between 1795 and 1802 during the wars of the French Revolution, and then again from 1806. Prince William of Orange was forced to hand it over to prevent it from falling into the hands of Napoleon. The British paid to the Dutch prince compensation of £6 million at the end of the war for keeping it. They found it too useful to give back. East India shipping going to and from India called in for fresh water and for food. And officers working for the East India Company and its army often went on leave to South Africa for the climate, which was healthier, and also for hunting expeditions. Cape Town itself is a very, very distinctive place, dominated by Table Mountain, the flat-topped stony mountain above it, by a very beautiful bay, the dramatic Cape itself, and also by a Mediterranean climate, which is far, far healthier than almost all the rest of Africa from the point of view of European visitors. The British and the Dutch settlers clashed over access to land and over the treatment of Africans, especially once the humanitarian movement on behalf of slaves gathered pace. The Boers and the local Africans both saw cattle as the principal form of wealth. There's a long tradition in southern Africa of lobola, the bride price paid in cattle, along with a wedding, as part of the wedding transaction. And Boer farmers and the African tribes living nearby were constantly in friction against one another, frontier friction, raiding and mutual theft. But this long-running sense of dissatisfaction suddenly came to a head with the abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1833. That's what prompted the migration of the Boer Voortrekkers into the interior of South Africa, a process which took place between about 1835 and about 1840, a long succession of Boer journeys. And that in turn brought them into conflict with the expanding Zulu kingdom. I mentioned in the previous lecture that once slavery was abolished in the empire, compensation was paid to the slave owners, but it was only paid in London, and it was impossible for most of the Boers to get to London, so they understandably felt cheated by the government. Louis Trichardt, Piet Retief and other legendary Boer leaders crossed the Orange River and the Vaal River, and in some cases even the Drakensberg Mountains, as they moved out into the interior. Somewhere between 10,000 and 14,000 migrants went off into the interior in wagon trains. And again, it's useful to think of an American analogy. The great wagon trains which started to cross the Great Plains on the Oregon Trail during the 1840s, or the Mormon track of the 1840s and early 50s out to Salt Lake City. The wagons were similar to American wagons, pulled by 4 or 8 oxen. Wagon trains travelling about 20 miles per day on flat land, with the herds being driven alongside. The men would shoot antelope for meat and take dangerous river crossings where crocodiles proved a hazard to the animals. Aware that they were moving into potentially hostile country, they'd circle the wagons at night into what's called a laager, on high ground, with the shafts of one wagon attached under the body of the next one, and then thorns and brambles interlaced between the wheels to create a very, very good defensive perimeter, so that if they were attacked, the men could shoot through the gaps. The Boers were famously good marksmen and trained their horses to stand still while they shot from the saddle. A horse will naturally tend to shy, but it's possible to train them to accommodate a shooting rider. Now today the Great Trek is commemorated by the Voortrekker Monument outside Pretoria. It was built on the 100th anniversary in the 1930s and is a spectacular stone monument, although very much under a shadow at the moment because it represents the bad old days of apartheid to the new South Africa. Well, the Voortrekkers themselves didn't know it, but as they crossed the Orange River and later the Vaal River, moving northwards, they were entering lands that had been desolated by the wars of the 1820s. And that meant that they encountered societies less well organised than they would have encountered if they'd gone before 1815. Many of them had adventures and disasters in the early days of the Great Trek. A group led by Louis Trigart made the heroic crossing of the Drakensberg Mountains, moving northeast into Natal itself, including lowering the wagons by rope down treacherous cliffs. But once they got into the tropical lowlands, they began to suffer from fever and from tsetse fly attacks on the animals, which usually would kill the farm animals. Another group, led by Hans van Rensburg, was massacred in the Limpopo River Valley. A much bigger group, in 1836-7, fought against Matabele tribesmen, and they found that these defensive laagers, the circled wagons, worked very well. And that on the counter-offensive, 40 mounted men working together with guns could take on 10,000 warriors on foot to reclaim stolen herds. Because cattle were a source of wealth to both groups, there's a constant attempt by the Africans to steal the animals and reprisal raids by the Boers trying to get them back again. The fact that they could fight successfully against big odds led to the development of a feeling of invincibility among some of the Boers. But on the other hand, they recognised that they had to stay in touch with the Cape Colony, with Cape Town, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to get new supplies of gunpowder. They had the advantage of arms, but they weren't able to manufacture their own munitions, so they couldn't break contact completely. The Boers, traditionally independent-minded people, found it very difficult to agree with one another, even on questions like where to settle or how to cooperate among themselves. And the rudimentary government they set up in the interior would often break down because of constant squabbles. Well, probably the most famous of all the Voortrekkers was Piet Retief. He led a group into Natal, making an easier southerly crossing of the Drakensberg Mountains, and began to negotiate a settlement with the Zulu king Dingaan. And at first, Dingaan and Piet Retief were able to cooperate. Now, just before the Great Trek started, the Zulu kingdom had been transformed, principally by Chaka, who was king from 1816 to 1828. And he turned the Zulus into a superb fighting force, a nation whose entire raison d'etre was warfare. They came to dominate the area between the Drakensberg Mountains and the coast, that is, the whole of present-day Natal. Their social structure itself was based on war. All the young men owed military service to the king, and they had to remain celibate until they'd killed or wounded a man in battle. This is a ritual referred to as the washing of the spears. They learned how to run 60 miles in one day, and to do it barefoot, so that Chaka's army was extremely mobile. It could cover great distances very quickly. From the time they entered into puberty right through until they were in their late 30s, every man lived not with his family, but in a barracks at one of the royal households which were spread out across the expanding Zulu kingdom. And their way of fighting was to run into battle very, very close to one another with short spears and stabbing swords and in close proximity. The Zulu kingdom was like ancient Sparta or like the Sioux on the Great Plains, warrior societies with everything else subordinated to the need for military victory. There was even a special Zulu formation for going into battle, which was a copy of the physiology of a bull. The central regiment was called the chest, and then the two horns, which would start to encircle an enemy as they approached. The 4th Regiment was the reserve, the loins of the bull, and very often their officers required them to turn away and face away from the battle to prevent them from getting too excited and from joining in prematurely. Each regiment of the army had its own colours on its shields, its own special song, and its own esprit de corps. And the barracks, which held these different regiments, had to be very widely separated within the Zulu kingdom to prevent inter-regimental fighting, each regiment so proud of its own particular prowess. An English eyewitness who saw a parade of the Zulus found it both impressive and terrifying. He wrote, "Full war dress with the uniform colour of the shields of each regiment, the sea of tossing white shields and waving ostrich plumes of the veterans, followed by the black and white shields of the younger regiments and the flashing of all the spears. The rhythmic stamping of 10,000 feet made the earth quake, an ominous display, which was heightened by the deep, sonorous chant of the warriors." Chaka himself, the king, had a large harem of over 1,000 women, but he never actually married any of them and had no children. Historians have speculated that either this was because he was impotent, or that having given birth to children, or his wife's given birth to children, he then had them killed to prevent one of them from becoming a usurper, which was a common fate in the African tribes of that time. Chaka had instant power of life and death over everybody, and was famous for astonishing acts of ruthlessness. For example, when his mother died, he was so overcome with grief that he ordered the killings of thousands of his own people as a purely arbitrary, capricious response to his own sense of grief. Having created this army, this ruthless fighting machine, he put it to use, and it won repeated battles, with the result that it set off echo effects in a widening area of southern Africa, a decade or more of severe dislocation. He would defeat one group, and the remnants of that group would flee, dislodging or fighting against others in turn, until vast homeless groups were wandering the interior of southern Africa. Farming became impossible and herding very hazardous. Everybody was on the move and starvation was widespread. One vast group of uprooted people gathered together under the leadership of a woman chief called Mantatisi, the so-called Mantatee Horde. Another one, cowering together on a flat-topped hill, was led by Mshweshwe, the founder of the Basuto nation. According to their folklore, 3 trails led up the hill, each one of which had a supply of boulders that could be rolled down on potential invaders. And their legend said that every night the hill, which is actually about 300 feet high, grew miles high every night to protect them against attack. The reign of Chaka came to an end when he was assassinated by his half-brother Dingaan in 1828, just before the Great Trek began. Now, the Battle of Blood River is one of the great moments of the conflict between the Voortrekkers and the Zulu, and it demonstrated the superiority of disciplined riflemen over much larger forces armed only with spears. The point about the Zulus' fighting method is this. In the days before firearms became common in the interior of Africa, closing with the enemy, especially closing in force at high speed, was an extremely effective way of fighting. But of course, mass frontal assaults against rifles were going to prove extremely damaging and deadly to the attacking force. At first, as I mentioned, there was peace between Piet Retief and Dingaan, but the Zulus became angry as more and more Boer arrivals came into the area. Finally, Dingaan invited Piet Retief to come to a parley, a discussion, but then betrayed him, seized him and murdered him and his immediate followers. Then, following up on this attack, the Zulu raiders attacked the Boer lagers. But a group of the Boers, 460 strong, made a stand at the Umslatas River. This is in December of 1838. As the Zulus approached, they prayed for deliverance and promised that if they were saved by God, they'd build a church in his honour. The wagon laager was surrounded with thorn bushes, and the defenders were able to beat off 11,000